afternoon, and thank you everyone so much for joining us on a rainy October afternoon. My name is Jessica Zavala, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health to today's webinar, Supporting and Engaging Students with Accommodation Needs. As you may be aware, October is National Disabilities Awareness Month. And while not all accommodations are for disabilities, accommodations for individuals with disabilities are one type of accommodations that will certainly be discussed today. And so before I introduce, or actually before I have Annalise to introduce our presenter today, I do have a few brief announcements to share. First and foremost, CME and CEU credits are available. The activity code for today's session is 56 TOWS, and so that's 56 TOWS. This code will expire on tomorrow, Thursday, October 17th at 12 noon. So please be on the lookout for information periodically posted via the chat function regarding how to obtain CME, CEU credit if that is something that you are interested in obtaining. And I will actually turn it over to Annalise to provide a few more announcements. Annalise?
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Annalise Fisher, and I am the Suicide Prevention and Health Promotion Manager for the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health. So to have some announcements here, first, please join us on November 7th, 2024 at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health November 2024 webinar, in which we'll be joined by Dr. Roxanne Pritchard from St. Thomas University. Dr. Pritchard will discuss the essential role of sleep in college mental health. Also, please save the date for the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health 7th Biannual Conference on May 15th, 2025. Keep an eye out because a call for presentations will be issued next month in November. You may also find additional details regarding upcoming events on our website and on our social media. So feel free to like and subscribe to our social media channels. During today's webinar, we encourage you to post questions and comments in the Q&A or the chat function throughout the presentation, and we hope that you'll engage in the discussion. Questions will be answered at the end of today's presentation. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and the video will be made available for viewing on our YouTube channel. So now to introduce our presenter, Amanda Feaster, PhD, MED, Director of Student Accessibility Services at Kent State University, and Clinical Consultant to the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health. Amanda is a native of Pennsylvania and a first-generation college student. Amanda, she, her, combines her personal and professional experiences to improve access to education for students with disabilities. She has 20 years of experience in higher education in both academic support and disability resource roles. Amanda currently serves as the Director of Student Accessibility Services at Kent State University, where she advocates on behalf of students with disabilities through campus-wide education, strategic leadership of a dedicated staff, and collaboration with campus partners. Amanda is a past president of the Ohio Association of Higher Education and Disability and holds a PhD in Higher Education Administration from Kent State University, a Master's of Art in Education and Higher Education Administration from the University of Akron, and a Bachelor of Arts in English from Shippensburg University. So now I'm going to pass it over to our presenter, Dr. Feaster.
Thanks so much, Annalise. Thank you all so much for being here today and for your interest in this topic. I'm gonna share my screen here. Hopefully do it correctly. You know, I've been doing this for so many years, you'd think it would be easy. Okay, so hopefully you are seeing the beginning of this presentation. So as Annalise mentioned, our topic today is supporting and engaging students with accommodation needs. My hope is that after today's webinar, you'll be able to identify some of the major types of accommodations students might have at the post-secondary level, understand the process by which accommodations are determined, and then be able to make effective referrals to the appropriate office based on student concerns as it makes sense within your roles. So I want to start first with just what is an accommodation. This is a word you may have heard, especially if you're working on a college campus. It's also a word that has other meanings outside of higher education. I learned the hard way. If someone asks, do you need an accommodation? That they might not always be talking about disability, and they might be talking about a hotel accommodation. So for our purposes today, an accommodation is an aid or adjustment provided to an individual to satisfy a need. Accommodations also might be required by specific laws or policies in some situations. And those are really the accommodations that we're going to talk about today. So two kind of chunks of accommodations that apply at the post-secondary level. The first is around pregnancy and gender equality. So you've likely heard of Title IX. It's part of the Education Amendments of 1972. And this specific statute is focused on protecting students from sex-based discrimination in all aspects of an educational program. And that includes sexual harassment, sexual assault, violence, etc. It also includes gender-based discrimination as it relates to pregnancy, childbirth, lactation, pregnancy loss or termination, and the recovery. So this applies to our students mostly who are experiencing a pregnancy or might be recovering from a pregnancy or pregnancy loss. Title IX, a lot of the information that kind of most of us hear about comes along in terms of the compliance side of things. So the Title IX statute does require a complaint process by which institutions investigate concerns of discrimination, harassment, or violence. And every institution has to have at least one designated individual to oversee that complaint process and to implement the required accommodations. In many institutions, it may be an entire office, or this may be part of the role that someone plays in maybe an equal opportunity office, occasionally in a disability resource office, a student affairs office. Your experience may vary depending on your institution and the size of your institution. So when we talk about Title IX accommodations, we are usually looking at things like excused absences from medical appointments or a medical leave to recover, being able to return to a program at the same status prior to the leave with no penalty for time off, breaks as needed. So for food and drink, being able to use the bathroom, lactation, as needed by the pregnant person. Furniture adaptations, especially on a college campus, you may have seen all of those desks with chairs that are very tiny and really don't fit most of us, especially pose a challenge when someone is pregnant. Also things like elevator access and parking, all things that maybe kind of pop into your mind already when you're thinking about a pregnant student or faculty or staff member navigating your campus. The process is typically pretty straightforward. So students request accommodations by meeting with the Title IX coordinator or that designated office. Again, that may vary depending on your institution, but there is someone who should be providing this service. Documentation might be required, but depending on what the person is asking for, they may not need to provide any documentation at all. So if they're asking for some of the standard accommodations, larger uniforms, access to water, restroom breaks, a bigger desk, the flexibility to sit or stand as needed throughout the day, documentation is typically not required for those types of accommodations. We also think about documentation and personal information being shared in a very limited capacity, if at all. with folks who need to know about an accommodation. So if you're in a faculty role, you may receive a little bit of communication about what that looks like. Similarly, if you are supervising somebody, but often the circumstances around which somebody receives Title IX accommodations are not disclosed to their supervisors, faculty, other folks in the office, unless there's an absolute need to know. So you may get an email or a letter letting you know that someone in your class has this accommodation. Most of the time should feel pretty straightforward, pretty logical, based off of sort of the general parameters of pregnancy. If you have questions about that, the Title IX office is always happy to answer those and provide you with information about how you can implement that in your set. In terms of thinking about how we support students who might need this kind of accommodation, I think it's really helpful to understand the process at your institution. A lot of post-secondary institutions do a lot of education around Title IX, focused on sexual harassment, sexual assault. So students may not even be aware that they have rights as a pregnant person under federal law. They also may not understand the process, and they may just be trying to work individually with their faculty or with the staff that they interact with. So it's really helpful also to refer students to that official process if they disclose a pregnancy or a related condition. This makes sure that students receive all the accommodations that they should be eligible for in all the settings. That way they're not negotiating with individual faculty or staff members and sort of at the mercy and the whim of individual understanding of our expectations for students and of the rights available to students. Working with the office in an official capacity allows that student to have the same experience and can help protect their privacy as well. They no longer need to explain to every professor or every staff member that they encounter why they need an accommodation. The office will help with those things. Another type of accommodation that we see quite a bit on college campuses, and this is one that has increased pretty significantly over the past 10 years or so, is disability accommodation. So when we talk about disability, we're talking about a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. That may be something that impacts someone's mobility or physical disability, such as a chronic illness. It may be a psychological disability, which it would include anxiety disorder, depressive disorders. It might be a sensory disability, so individuals who are blind or have low vision or deaf or hard of hearing. It also might include a learning disability that impacts reading, writing, or math. It might be ADHD. It might be autism. There's a huge potential list of conditions that might be considered a disability. When I explain it to students, I often say something that is maybe a little different about your body or your brain that might impact your ability to do the typical college student stuff might be a disability. Folks with disabilities have several types of federal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So ADA is the common shorthand. There were amendments in 2008 that expanded protections for individuals. And that's really where we started to see an increase in some types of accommodation requests in offices like mine. And then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was that initial piece of legislation. Those are all designed to prohibit discrimination of people with disabilities and to require accommodation in an attempt to provide equal access to opportunities and the experiences. Depending on the type of institution that you're at, you may have different titles of the ADA that apply to you. So if you're a public institution, we're usually talking about Title II. Private institutions, we might be talking about Title III. There are some differences between those two in terms of how they get applied. Most of the time, it's not necessarily something that most people have to think about unless you work in a disability office or general counsel or have gotten put in charge of accommodation. So for most of us, the important thing to know is that if you are a public access space, so something that anyone can come to, like a public institution, or you're providing education and you receive federal funding, you're likely bound by at least one of those laws requiring your institution to provide accommodation. Accommodations are determined through an interactive process on a case-by-case basis. Some examples of accommodations you might see include things like extended testing time, reduced distraction testing, or some students call it small group testing. We also might see recording of lectures, note-taking assistance, ASL interpreters or transcribers, caption videos, alternative format textbooks, to use text-to-speech software or speech-to-text software. This is a very small snippet of some of the accommodations that we provide at Kent State. I feel pretty confident in speaking for disability resource providers everywhere. We have a huge list of accommodations that we work with for our student populations, and that number of accommodations grows on a regular basis. So this is just a very small snippet of what that looks like. So for students to be eligible for accommodations, we use what we call the interactive process. So it is essentially straightforward. There is interaction between the student and the office that is designated to provide those accommodations. The name of that office might be different depending on your institution. You might see accessibility services, disability resource, a variety of different types of names. Your institution may have a clever name that becomes a good acronym. For the purposes of this, I'm going to refer to all of those offices as a disability resource office. And if anybody isn't sure what their office is called at their institution, I'd be happy to help you dig into that. So we start off with students meeting with our office. The specific process for what that looks like is going to vary by institution. Some schools use an online application. Other schools have students just stop by the office and set up an appointment. Again, whatever your institution uses, that student connection with the disability resource office is typically the most informative part of the disability accommodation process. So we really focus on understanding the student, understanding their disability, what their accommodation experience has been like so far, what they know works for them, what they know doesn't work for them, what they're worried about in the college environment, and then what resources they used in high school that we might think about how they can use something similar in college. Most offices also request some type of documentation of the student's disability. Again, that's going to vary depending on the institution. Many of us ask for if the student had an IEP or a 504 plan from high school. So it's an individualized education plan or a 504 plan. Those are high school documents that outline a student's disability and their accommodations. Those documents do not automatically transfer to college with a student, but they do provide documentation that offices like mine can use to determine accommodations for a student. Students, however, do not need to have had an IEP or a 504 plan to be eligible for college accommodations. Most of us also have a form that students can take to a provider that guides that person through answering information about their disability and functional limitations. We are often do our best to reduce the barrier around documentation as well. So we try to get the information that we need from whatever format we can get it from. So we've even had students bring us, a file of papers from high school or a letter from a doctor. As long as it's giving us the information we need, most of us aren't too picky about where it comes from, as long as it's coming from somebody who's licensed to diagnose or treat the individual. We then take the information we get from the student, the information we have from their documentation, put it together and determine accommodations that are designed for equal access for students with disabilities. So we're looking to try to remediate or remove institutional barriers to access that arise because of the disability. Again, you're going to see things like extra time, being able to record lectures, maybe alternative format text. Those are going to vary by student based on their disability. Some students, even with the same disability, may have different accommodations. And students often have the choice of how they want to use those accommodations. So an important part of using accommodations is the notification of instructors. And again, that's going to vary a little bit depending on your institution. Some of us use an electronic system where students log in, request the accommodations they're eligible for, and they're assigned to each class, and their instructors are notified via email. Some of us are writing a letter that outlines the accommodations for the student, and the student picks it up and takes it to their instructor. So a variety of different ways, but that notification piece is really important for students to make sure their instructors know that they are eligible to use accommodations. For most of us as well, we do not provide disability-specific information on that letter. So we're not necessarily telling faculty what types of, like why students have the accommodations they have, what their disability is, just simply that the student is eligible for accommodations and the list of accommodations that they need to provide, the option at least for the student to have. When I talk about disability accommodations, I always like to just give a little overview of the differences between high school and college, because the processes can be pretty significantly different depending on a person's experience. So in high school, the school has a responsibility to identify and determine eligibility for students who have disabilities or who might have disabilities. So the school is providing that testing, the documentation, all of that information. In college, this is a student-driven process. So the student is responsible for providing the documentation, potentially including if they have not ever been assessed, maybe paying for the assessment to determine their disability. The student also has to be the one to come to the disability resource office and identify themselves to say, hi, I have a disability, I'd like accommodations. So no one does that for them, and the institution does not go out and look for students with disabilities, though many of us do promote our services in our office. Our office here specifically is involved in everything from admissions events all the way up through to like graduation fairs, to encourage students to get connected with us, and so to make them available, and to be really just sort of proactive and try to reduce some of that stigma around disability. In high school, accommodations can alter the curriculum because they're focused on individual success. In college, our accommodations are focused on equal access to opportunity. So students may be used to having their exams shortened. Maybe instead of 5 multiple choice options, they're shortened down to just 2 options. Maybe their assignments are shorter. Maybe they have more time to complete them. There's a variety of different ways that IEP and 504 plan can interact with the curriculum. In college, because we're focused on that equal access, we cannot alter the essential functions of a course or a program. So all of the students who have disabilities and who use accommodations are taking the same courses, meeting the same academic standards, and following the same programs and learning outcomes as their non-disabled peers. And so we are not able to adjust those requirements. We can, however, accommodate students by giving them extra time to demonstrate their knowledge, assistive technology to be able to write their papers, take their exams, etc. So we're sort of adding in things rather than being able to remove a requirement. In high school, students might have an IEP or a 504 plan that goes to all their teachers, and it might share a lot of their information in detail. In college, students notify their instructors of accommodation using whatever their institution's official means are. So that may be that accommodation email that's generated from the system. It may be picking up that letter, whatever that looks like for the school. That information does not go to the professor unless the student initiates that process. Additionally, we don't share specific disability information beyond our office. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with FERPA, which is federal privacy protections for our students. So we can share information on our campus with other faculty and staff, if they have a need to know, what we have deemed necessary for them to know is that a student is eligible for accommodation and the list of accommodations that the student is eligible for, not specific disability information, access to the entire file, those kinds of things. So I think you'll find that most of us keep that information separate. This is helpful for students to know, especially if they had an experience in high school where they felt sort of disillusioned by the IEP process. Those processes can focus a lot on the school, and depending on parents, might focus a lot on the parental involvement and what the parents are looking for that student. That can be really helpful in high school, especially when students aren't totally sure what they need and their parents are good advocates for them. However, it may also make them a little more hesitant to seek out accommodations when they come to college because they're a little worried about how that experience is going to transfer. So we like to let students know there's additional privacy protection in the college environment for accommodations, and that the student's really in control of deciding who knows about their disability accommodation and when. So we have some students who never use accommodations, even though they're eligible. Other students who use their accommodations every single class, for every quiz, every assignment, every test, for the entire time they're with us. And most students are somewhere in between, depending on the courses they take, the types of assignments that they have, and what else is going on. They may pick and choose which accommodations they want to use depending on that environment. So we really like to encourage students to think about like what they need, and then to use it as much or as little as they need, knowing that they can maintain privacy around why they have accommodations, and even if they have accommodations, if they so choose. So as we think about supporting students with disabilities in particular, you'll see some parallels between this and the Title IX stuff. I think the most important part is learning about your disability resource office. Know what it's called. If you have an opportunity to meet individuals over there, or even just learn their names, that can really solidify a referral. If you are a counselor or a faculty member and you're able to say to your student, I've met Julie in the SAS office, I think that she could talk with you about this, it goes so much further than please refer to the SA office website, right? So we know that, I hate the phrase warm handoff after COVID, I just really have not been able to say it. But that connection, sort of transferring the trust that the student may have put into you, into that disability resource office. It's also really helpful to set appropriate expectations, so not promising specific accommodations or implying that the disability resource office can fix all the problems. So we have had students come to us and say, oh, my professor said if you put this in a letter, they'll do whatever you say. We love the spirit of that, but we do want to make sure that we're setting the right expectations for students. We do not expect folks outside of our offices to be experts on accommodation. If you have a suggestion of something you think a student should ask about, that can be really helpful for them. But if at all possible, avoid making promises of specific accommodations, specific ways that the office can help, or sort of setting this office up as like the place with all the answers. We have a lot of answers, but also we have a lot of limitations to what we can do. So often, most of us are not academic advisors necessarily. So we work with folks across campus and we can help to connect students to the various resources, but we often don't do all of those things in-house. Be respectful when you're making a referral. I generally feel like this is sort of kind of goes without mentioning. Anytime we're in a relationship with students where we are trying to assist them, we want to always try to stay as respectful as possible. And we don't want to make assumptions about disability. So whether that is not making assumptions about what type of disability somebody has, or even if they have a disability. So if you are seeing something in a student that makes you think they might benefit from accommodations, and you want to make that referral, but they have not disclosed a disability, focusing on those observable actions without inferring a causality can help kind of bridge that gap. So a common example that we use with our faculty is when they notice that students are not finishing their exams. Maybe they're taking the full amount of time, but they still haven't finished their exam. Rather than assuming that the student has a disability, checking in with the student. I've noticed, Jessica, that you have not finished your exams in the amount of class time. Tell me about what your approach is to these exams. Tell me about your studying. Tell me about what happens when you sit down to take the exam. And then the student may disclose, well, I've never been a good test taker. I had accommodations when I was in high school. I could take my test with a special ed teacher or in the resource room. I just don't want to do that in college, right? So opening that door to you to be able to say, our disability resource office works with students in exactly this situation. Here's how I know that they can be helpful. Do you want me to help connect you? It's then, of course, always up to the student if they want to follow through with that. But you sort of opening the door to the understanding of disability being something that we routinely accommodate in college, that we accommodate it in a different way than in high school, and that disability can look different in college too. So we know students between 18 and 25, that age range is a common onset for a lot of psychiatric conditions as well. So we're seeing students not only who had disabilities that were accommodated throughout their K-12 learning, but also students who are developing those disabilities as they're enrolled with us in college. And so they've never used the word disability to describe their condition, or they've never thought that they might be eligible for accommodation. So you may be the first person to have that conversation with a student. So even having a go-to definition of disability might be helpful in explaining why the office is available, why you think the office is a good fit for that student, and some things that they might be able to think about asking for when they go. Certainly when they get to us, we are happy to dig into definitions. We will talk about documentation, we will talk about accommodations and the whole process, all of those things. Getting the students to us is sometimes the hardest part, and that is where you all really are super helpful in terms of identifying students who might need that additional support and getting them to come to talk with us. So I want to just sort of talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing within our office and then sort of in the field nationally, I would say probably globally as well. We are seeing a lot of requests for deadline and attendance flexibility. So students asking for an increased number of absences, extended deadlines, especially for large projects, sometimes several days to weeks. This is something that's coming up quite a bit for us and also sort of relates to the last point on this slide around students who need executive functioning support that goes beyond a simple accommodation. We're seeing more and more students who are not coming with time management skills, organizational skills, and they're being, they're in a new environment. So automatically that is going to throw off everything you think you know about yourself when you show up to college. The difference in the way we teach classes in college versus what they had in high school is always an adjustment for students. It can become especially tricky when students are used to having some adaptations or some built-in support during their day. And then they go to college and those things don't exist in the same way anymore. Students maybe, I would say at most institutions are typically encouraged to be full-time, especially when they first start. That may be too much for some students. We've seen some students who really benefit from going part-time all year long and maybe taking a little bit longer, or students who just need to start a little slower, get their feet under them, figure out what works for them, figure out how they want to manage their time, and then they're able to be full-time in future semesters. So I always like to remind students the national average for completing a bachelor's degree is 6 years. We tend to call it a 4-year degree, but takes most people more than 4 years to complete that. And that is sometimes the answer if we have students who are struggling to complete their work on time, balancing a lot of different things, right? They're balancing their own personal, like their body. They're balancing the anxieties of just living in the world right now, maybe in addition to an anxiety disorder, those types of things. We're seeing more and more students who work or have other types of familial obligations. So students, this idea of like, oh, you're 18, go to college, you have no worries, just party. Is not what most of our students look like. I think most of you are probably pretty aware of some of the challenges that our students are facing. And so sometimes the answer is not an accommodation. Sometimes the answer is, let's take fewer classes, or let's work on some strategies around completing tasks, breaking down larger assignments, those kinds of things. Sometimes it's about picking the right classes. So some institutions provide priority registration for disabled students. So here at Kent State, our students are the very first group of students to register for their classes. And that allows our students to be able to choose online classes if they have, say, a chronic illness that impacts their ability to get to campus. It lets them, choose a class maybe at the best time of day for them. If you take ADHD medication in the morning, you probably don't want to take calculus at 4:30 p.m. So you probably want to try to take those classes at the times of day where your brain is really operating the best. So that priority registration piece is something that we like to encourage students to use to reduce the number of times they might need to ask for an extension and to sort of put them in control of their environment as best as you can be in a college setting. We're seeing increasing guidance about Title IX accommodation. So if you read Inside Higher Ed or any of those types of education blogs, the Department of Ed has always got opinions about Title IX. So what that looks like and the compliance pieces of that change quite a bit. We just got some new information earlier this year. So if you are working with students, it's helpful to kind of just have a general sense that that information changes, and that tends to increase our obligations to students, not just around necessarily pregnancy, but also gender equity and sexual harassment, discrimination types of things as well. For residential campuses, we're seeing a lot of housing accommodation requests, as well as accommodations for emotional support animals. So that's, I probably shouldn't have used ESA. That stands for emotional support animal. So that's an animal that has an established therapeutic relationship with the student and is permitted in the residence halls as an accommodation for the student's disability. So we have students here who have cats, dogs, we have some birds, we have some ferrets, we have some, what else, some like lizards and other little reptile creatures that students have as an accommodation to be able to live in the residence hall to assist with their disability in this environment. We're also seeing a lot of accommodation requests around a single room. So students who have increased anxiety or sensory needs that really make living with somebody else really very incredibly challenging, if not impossible. So we're working with students about housing accommodations. Throughout the year, we prefer to do that before the students get here so we can identify the right place for them, but we do work on it throughout the year. So if you're working with a rising senior or someone who's thinking about college and they plan to live on campus, I would also suggest you encourage them to think about if they need housing accommodation, and if so, what that might look like, so they can request that early. Certainly that also includes physical accommodations like a roll-in shower, a strobe light for a student who's deaf or hard of hearing so they can know when the fire alarm is going off, those types of physical adaptations as well. And then we're also seeing students who have needs beyond what accommodations can really support. And so that's where working with academic coaches, tutors, and other folks in the academic success realm has been really helpful for our students. Just helping to balance their time, break down large projects, stay organized, stay on top of the 85 emails that they likely get every day, and developing systems to navigate the expectations of their college campus and the classes, because it changes all the time and is often not explicitly clear. So especially when we think about students with autism, maybe who don't pick up on that sort of hidden curriculum easily, we find our office working with our campus partners to try to provide some of that additional support. the answer in that case is often not an accommodation, but some type of support, whether that's a structured support like a tutoring program or just a connection with someone on campus where students feel comfortable saying, I got this email, I don't know what this means, help me break this down, to be able to ask those types of questions. So we're doing a lot more of that as well, which is a chance for us to really interact with our students on an ongoing basis, but also to connect students to other offices on campus where folks are doing some of that like structured work around supplemental instruction, tutoring, and academic coaching to build those skills as well. I am back to that. So I have just a few websites that might be helpful for you. The Pregnant Scholar is a really helpful website for helping pregnant scholars. So if you are assisting a student or you yourself are pregnant or may become pregnant during the time that you are enrolled in education, that website has some good resources in terms of how processes work, what you can ask for, what your rights are. Just a good overview. It is not campus specific, but it does give you sort of an overview of what you can expect from Title IX protections. JAN is the Job Accommodation Network. I don't expect that most of you are providing on-the-job accommodations, but this is a good global website to think about accommodations for people with disabilities. It's focused on the workplace, but a lot of these accommodations can be adjusted or can inform a conversation at the college level. So it's really set up that you can navigate it to look at accommodations based on disability or functional limitation. So if you or a student that you're working with have never had accommodations before, Jan just sort of gives you a sense of the full scope of what's out there. I also really like to use Jan when we have conversations with students. We hear occasionally, I can't accommodate this student. They don't get extra time in the real world. Well, accommodations are a thing in the real world, quote unquote. It's all the real world, right? But accommodations exist in the workplace, and a website like askjan.org will give you a lot of information about that. It helps our students get prepared for what happens beyond college. And then the National Center for College Students with Disabilities has a lot of great resources, articles, and information focused towards students, but then also just sort of general information. That's sometimes a great link to send to somebody who says, I don't know if I have a disability, I'm not really sure. They've got some information there that might be helpful. Or students who are hesitant about asking for accommodations, a chance to see what's out there and what might be helpful for them. I want to see we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. I am gonna stop sharing my screen and take a look in the chat. Am I okay to just pop right in there and start answering those, or do you want me to do it in a specific order? Or Annalise?
You are more than welcome to moderate those questions. And I was just going to encourage folks. First of all, thank you for that very informative presentation. Lots of great information. I have about a half page of notes myself from information that you presented on. And so just want to encourage folks, as you have questions, to feel free to place them inside of the chat or Q&A, but feel free, Dr. Feaster, to answer those questions.
We've got someone asking about accommodations for someone who's given birth being out of a lab for 6 weeks. The time after, especially like a 6-week recovery period, can feel pretty overwhelming in terms of thinking about how a student might make up a lab. So that's really where you want to work with the student and your Title IX coordinator about, if that is appropriate or the best option. So sometimes having things adjusted time-wise can be really helpful. Sometimes it's better for the student to be able to kind of pick up in the next semester. Sometimes there may be alternate assignments that make sense. It really is going to depend on the type of lab and the type of experience that the student is going through. both Title IX and ADA accommodations have a process for us to think about like what is actually reasonable and what makes sense in this situation. So having those conversations with the coordinator or the person in your campus who has that sort of determination authority is really helpful. We want your input on that. We make accommodations based on what we know and what we think makes sense, knowing that it's going to be very different when the students show up in your space. So please reach out to us. We want to have those conversations and talk through like, really, does this make sense, and is this in the best interest of the student? You'll have some students who have no concern jumping right back in after 6 weeks, and others where an incomplete is a better option, or picking up in another semester makes more sense to them. So someone says, I have students who share that they're on the autism spectrum and struggle with ADHD symptoms. You suggest they seek support. The student refuses. They're resistant to having a label. Yeah, if I could fix this, I would really, like, my job would be so much easier. What we have seen that is helpful in terms of referring students to SAS or your disability resource office is reminding them about the privacy piece. Professors do not know why students have accommodations. I will not tell them. I've argued with faculty about it before. I'm not going to tell you. You don't need to know. What you need to know is what accommodations the student's eligible for. So we don't share that information. We also use the same accommodation format for students who have a chronic health condition, a psychological disorder, a learning disability, any number of accommodation reasons, any number of disabilities. So the student doesn't have to tell anybody outside of our office what their disability is. They also don't have to use the accommodations every time. So I think in high school, we tend to see sort of a binary approach of if you don't use your IEP, you might potentially lose that IEP. That is not the case in college. We want our students to decide where and when they use those accommodations. As long as they follow that notification process, they can decide for each class, even down to each exam, if they want to use accommodations or not. So they can really narrow in on where it's helpful. Some of our students need it every single time, every single class. And we love that. Other students pick and choose. We love that. Other students get connected with us when they start and we never see them again. And we love that. As long as they're using that in a way that makes sense to them, just sort of reinforcing that idea of you get to control this and you get to keep it as secret as you want to keep it can help students have a little more kind of confidence in the process as well. And sometimes it's helpful for us to reach out to the student. So if you've been working with somebody and you notice that they're hesitant to actually do the outreach, you think an email from someone in our office is helpful, don't be afraid to ask us if we can send a student. We don't like to just like cold call them and say, hey, your professor thinks you have a disability, right? We're going to ease in. It's great when you have that conversation first. But if us reaching out to them is also helpful, we're willing to do that as well. So that's a great question. Another question, works at Neomed. A lot of students are second language learners, exploring possible accommodation. Okay, so this is a different kind of potential accommodation. So being an English language learner is not in and of itself a disability. However, we know that these students often are translating information one time, maybe several times, depending on how many languages they know. And they're also at Neomed, obviously doing that in a medical environment. That is a lot of mental calculation. So those are not necessarily students who might qualify for a disability accommodation, but might benefit from having some extra time. I don't want to specifically give you a reference to an office because I'm not familiar at Neomed with who's doing that, but most offices have an ESL program or an academic support person who might be able to have this conversation. We have many faculty who are very willing to provide a little extra time for students or to allow them to use a dictionary. What that looks like is going to depend obviously on the student and on their situation. But I would say don't be afraid to encourage students to ask. If they feel comfortable just even asking their faculty directly, or to find out if there is a specific way to receive that support on your campus. So it's often not going to be the Disability Resource Office, but it might be the Academic Success Academic Resource Center as well. That's a great question. We get that a lot. See that there's some questions here in the chat as well. So someone says, we talk about an animal having an established relationship with the person. Yes, Deanne, this comes up with us a lot too. So students coming to like mental health providers asking for documentation. They don't have an animal yet, but they say, if I can get approval, I'll go to the APL and adopt an animal. Oh, it's big. That is a big thing. First of all, always know that we in disability services encourage you to use your professional clinical judgment. If you are in a position for providing documentation, we do not expect you to do it if you feel it is beyond the scope of your practice. Lots of counselors say, not getting into that. That's okay with us. We don't want to push you. We don't know all the things you know. So you do what makes sense for you in terms of those processes. We have worked with some students who maybe don't have an established relationship with this specific animal. So like an example that I can think of recently is a student who had a really close relationship with her cat at home. The cat was 17. The cat was not going to do well in the residence halls. It was going to be a tough adjustment. But the student could tell us, and their therapist confirmed, that this cat is essentially the reason that they left their room and left their house for many days at a time. They wake up to feed the cat. They make sure that they're playing with the cat, so it keeps them from being in bed all day, right? So we have a sort of a history of having this type of relationship. In that case, I think we did approve that the student was able to get another cat to bring because they did have that history. I'm going to say we do everything on a case-by-case basis, so it doesn't ever hurt to ask. But we are looking for some evidence of a therapeutic relationship there. So simply, Annalise likes cats is not the same thing as Annalise will benefit from having an emotional support cat. So kind of digging into that. And then if it's helpful for you and the student to have a conversation with us about that, if it's something you think makes sense, let's have that conversation. That's going to vary a little bit by institution as well. But we try not to stand in the way of students getting what they need if it's something that we can work around. The animal thing is always a tricky time. Okay. Do you have suggestions about the process of assisting students with an emerging mental health concern? Oh, yeah, this is so we have a question from a counseling center therapist having trouble helping students navigate missing coursework when they suddenly feel a higher level of care for mental health or need to take time off due to mental health. This is all we're doing right now. This like midterm time it's such a hard conversation because students do not want to think about withdrawing from a class or even taking a semester off, if that makes sense. It hurts my heart every time we have this conversation because I know that school is sometimes like the big motivator for students and it keeps people moving forward. However, we want to try to think long term, right? School is always going to be there for you. You have to be there for you. You have to stay in a good place physically and mentally to continue going to school, and that has to be the most important thing no matter what. We have options for incompletes, withdrawing from classes, taking time off from medical leave. There are all these options available to students. We also have options to maybe withdraw from one class, but not the rest, to be part-time for a semester. And so just letting students know we have these options and then who they can talk to about those options. Depending on your campus, it might be disability resources, it might be their academic advisor. Often it's a combination of folks to talk about what all the options are. It is not usually an all or nothing proposition. A nothing option might, if that is truly what's best for the student, then that's absolutely there. But a lot of times we have some flexibility around dropping down to part-time, taking it incomplete, those kinds of things. And that's where pulling in a disability resource person or an academic advisor can really help make the difference between it feeling just so black and white, like either I can do it or I can't, so much in between. So let us help you have that conversation if you would like. This is the time of year for that. It's just been like really a big challenge for our students as they try to balance it all. So do we have conversations with students before submitting documentation to explore the process? Yeah, so that again depends a little bit on the institution. So here our process is set up for students to do the application and provide their documentation. But if they don't have it, they can still reach out to us. They can still talk with us about what we need and why we need it. And do they maybe have something that would work, even if in their minds it's not official documentation? So we could absolutely have that conversation with students, especially if they're not sure what documentation even is or what that looks like. That's 2 more questions. So do students on your campus who need a diagnosis go to the counseling office on campus, or do they get referred out? So that is gonna depend on specific campuses. Here at Kent State, our counseling and psychological services folks are licensed to diagnose. So if it is within the parameters of their relationship with the student, if the student has met with them, done the intake, all those things, they are able to diagnose. Depending on the circumstances, they also might refer folks off campus. They do provide some assessments, but not everything. So we try not to get into who can diagnose you in which place, just to let folks kind of navigate based off of the services they're looking for. Here we have a couple of different counseling offices. They don't all diagnose based off of their levels of licensure and their training program goals. So we do try to help students identify the one that makes sense for them, kind of based on where they're at with the diagnosis process. There is, though, not a problem on our end with receiving documentation from our campus counseling office. I know folks sometimes worry about that internally. We're okay with taking it. If you're okay with giving it based on your professional standards, we're okay with taking it. And we have a question about interpreting for a deaf student. With communication, we want to make sure that we are using the most meaningful form of communication. So if someone is a deaf student who's an ASL user, likely ASL is their primary language. And without the auditory input, even if they learn English in a written format to be able to complete papers, the spoken English is not going to work out as well for them. So if the student's communication preference is an ASL interpreter, we tend to defer to that. Real-time captioning like PART might be an appropriate accommodation. It really is just going to depend on the student and their circumstances. Typically, if the student has used interpreters predominantly in their education in the past, that's where we're going to stick. But sometimes CART does make sense. It really depends a lot on the student and the circumstances. I'm sorry, that's not more specific. I just saw that it's 1 o'clock. Should I stop talking now?
I was going to say if you had time to do one more, but we are right at 1 o'clock. And so certainly I want to thank you again. And if you all would join me in the chat to thank Dr. Amanda Feaster for her knowledge and her expertise today. It's been a wonderful opportunity to hear more about supporting students with accommodations. Again, this has been an excellent topic. It has been great information that has been conveyed today. And so we hope to see you next month for our November webinar. And if not, then we hope to see you in the spring as we will start in January with our January webinar. Again, one last time, the code for today is 56 TOWS. That's 56 TOWS, and that will expire tomorrow at 12 noon. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you again to Dr. Amanda Feaster. Thank you to my colleague, Annalise Fisher, and Madison Gaskill for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.